Welcome to this week's episode of Church Unscripted. We're so glad that you're here joining us. This past weekend, we had a little bit of a different service, so we're going to take it a little bit different this week. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, share it with a friend, so we can get the word out and you can be updated on future episodes of Church Unscripted. So I have Pastor John, Pastor Eric with me today, and currently the roof above us is actually being replaced. And so if you do hear some of those weird things, that's what's happening.
Is that the impact driver in my ear?
Yeah,
I thought I had tinnitus or something.
So if we're shouting at you, we're not meaning to. We're just trying to talk to each other over the volume of impact drills on the roof. So we're thankful for a new roof, though.
Hey, we needed it.
We do. Yeah. Right. So so this past weekend we had a VBS and then we had Summer Blast. I thought we could just start by kind of just talking through some of our observations, some of the things we loved to experience at VBS, things that we enjoyed. Eric, what was maybe one of your favorite things, or maybe something surprising about VBS this weekend?
Yeah, so I remember doing VBS when I was a kid, and VBS was a little bit different back then. I think we met at people's homes, and it was a lot smaller groups. Maybe that was something completely different.
It felt like VBS, though.
It felt like VBS.
It was in the summer, and it happened.
Yeah, that's right. I remember doing games and crafts and stuff, so apparently it had to be the same thing. I was a little bit nervous about this, though, because for years, Brookside, during our summer, instead of VBS, we partnered with another camp ministry that would come on site and set up an entire experience, and it'd be a week-long extravaganza, right? And so we decided to do something different, do our own VBS, and I was nervous because I thought, okay, there's a whole lot of work, there's a whole lot of energy that needs to be put in by a whole lot of people. And I thought, are we going to have the manpower? Are we going to have the energy levels required to really pull off a great VBS experience for our kids? I wasn't sure how many kids were going to sign up or anything like that. I wasn't sure about the quality of the experience. But then as that train began to pick up speed, you began to see all of those issues resolved. And so one of my favorite things was to see so many volunteers step up and give of so much time. I mean, there's a lot of cases where there are people who really didn't have a ton to do. Yeah. And oftentimes you don't want volunteers to come and just not have anything to do. But I think it was because so many people showed up that the planning and the work was taken care of so quickly.
I think they said we had 104 volunteers and 114 kids.
That's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. That was incredible.
Amazing.
Yeah. Now the good thing is that if you didn't have like a lot of work to do as a volunteer, you could spend your time either talking to other volunteers, build those relationships, which is what I did a lot, or you could just kind of step in where you saw a need and love on these kids. And I saw so many volunteers do that. So I would say that's one of my favorite things. Of course, that's secondary to any kid who actually got to know Jesus more and gave their life to him. And so that's, of course, the entire reason we did it.
Yeah. John, what about you? What's something surprising or awesome?
Highlights? Yeah. I could say highlights. I was amazed. Just Sunday was an amazing service. I thought that was very different. If you haven't experienced an outdoor service, I think that was one to experience because you got to see kind of what the kids did all week. Yeah. It was great to say, Jesus cares for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Like really loud. I was like, wow, everyone's responding. Yeah. I think one of the things that was so great to what you said about volunteers is there was people filling so many different roles. It wasn't necessarily just with kids. It was with food, or it was with setup or tear down or decorations, or, you go down the list and there's so many different things that people were doing. And I think it mobilized us so that we can continue to do that in different ways for different opportunities to reach our community and see opportunities with that. And I think Sunday, it was parents seeing that their kids learned something. I don't know. That was a thing for me, is like, everyone's like, man, my kids learned something. It was only 2 nights and we learned something really big. I think that was huge. And so, that was exciting. I like that. I mean, the bounce house was great, but I didn't get Eric in the bounce house.
Next year
I'm
we
not
need a
going to break my legs like
dunk tank. Dunk tank. We talked about that.
Tell you what, if you bribe me enough, I'll get in the dunk tank.
Eric,
how about that?
Your whole job the whole weekend is just dunk tank.
Dunk tank?
Yeah.
That's a hot day. I'll be the most comfortable person at the whole event.
Last Sunday where it was rainy.
Something else that I really enjoyed is it's going to the volunteer thing again. but there was a lot of volunteers who were a little bit too old to be a part of it themselves, but they were junior volunteers. And so my daughter, who's 13, and so many like junior high volunteers, it was cool to see how they really stepped up and took an authoritative role.
Yeah.
And so I saw my daughter for the first time show kind of parental kind of skills. And so shepherding these kids, holding kids' hands, sitting down with a kid that's crying. And it was really cool to see these junior volunteers step up in big ways and have a leadership opportunity that they can really learn from.
I love that. I love seeing the kids lead worship to their peers and to younger kids. And that was cool. I loved one of our focuses this year is relational connectedness.
Yeah.
And kind of what you mentioned, like I loved seeing all the volunteers that maybe didn't have a huge role, but they were connecting with other people in ways that they probably never would have. I thought the whole weekend was great.
Yeah, I agree.
I loved it.
I agree. We haven't even gotten a summer blast from Sunday, so that's a whole experience in and of itself, which was incredible. But I do have a question. So one of the things I liked about VBS, was that every activity, every craft that there was a way to connect it to some spiritual reality. So I was a part of the games, and so we did some really kind of simple, silly games. One of them was you had to take a bucket of water, and with these little tiny cups, you had to transfer it to another bucket of water. The fun part of it was that half the water is lost on the way there, right? So these kids are running and they're losing the water. But the spiritual idea that came from that is the way that you were, in a sense, filling up the bowl for your pet so that your pet could have clean drinking water, right? That's the same thing that our God does to us. He loves to provide us the spiritual nourishment and the things that we need for our livelihood. And so it was a really cool opportunity to take a very simple, funny game and give it a spiritual reality. So here's my question. So how do we?
He's looking at me. Do you see this? He's looking at me all the time like, what?
He's like, I want to drill John because John always drills me.
Exactly. Yeah. Payback right now.
Yeah, this is. Yeah.
That's right. So I'm going to ask him because he'll probably have a better answer and then you can respond.
Whoa.
So, there you go.
Okay.
Gloves are on the ground.
On the what?
That's where you start a duel. You start a duel.
I don't know that.
You throw your gloves on the ground. Okay.
No.
I got my gloves on.
He totally messed it up.
I messed that up.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. All right, what's the question? Let's see.
Okay, back on track now. So here's the question. How do we as parents take just kind of daily, even fun, silly activities that we might do in our home, and we don't have to spiritualize everything, right?
Yeah.
That can get weird really quick.
Yeah.
But how do we take like a bike ride or how do we take a family game night and kind of bring some kind of a spiritual emphasis to it?
I think I noticed with the kids, even this weekend at VBS, there's not a lot of really instruction. It's a lot of questions. And so I've found like with my kids, the easiest way to take a spiritual turn is just to start asking questions. Like, how do you think the sun got there? Like, how do you think the sky is this color? Or, and it starts to make them think and like, oh, like God made that. Like he made it this way. And I think simple ways, just asking questions and being like kind of a child in our own way of like, sometimes I wonder, why is the sky so pretty? Or why is it this way or that way? I think questions is a huge way that we can just kind of bring that spiritual without making it like, super weird. I think sometimes, we can force that spiritual conversation, but just by asking questions, I think if we're diligent in discipling our kids, they will naturally take things spiritual if you ask the right questions.
I'm really glad that you pointed that out because I think we get scared of discipling our kids because we think it's some formalized study we've got to do with them. But in reality, the most opportune times are when you're surprised by them.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, I can see how this can be turned into a conversation. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be an hour conversation. Maybe it's just a simple question. What do you think Jesus thinks about that? How would you think Jesus would respond? And I think those are very good opportunities. Here's another question for you guys.
Whoa. I got some thoughts on this too.
Should we give him the opportunity?
One up me.
I know. I got some thoughts to add.
Good luck.
I have a phrase
I thought of. And then we're going to throw the gloves on the ground again or whatever it is that you said.
Gloves on the, I don't know what I was doing. Okay. I was threatening a duel. We have to take 3 steps each direction or whatever.
Yeah, you totally missed it.
I don't know.
Dude, you're mixing all kinds of metaphors here.
This is the problem with having summer blast this weekend. I'm just like, every moment is a teachable moment. That's the thing. Like when you were saying that, I was thinking, and Eric, as you were talking, I kept thinking every moment's a teachable moment. The moment we veer off that is when we're not discipling our kids. And so those moments that you think aren't teachable moments, like, honestly, why are you feeling the way you're feeling? Asking the why question. And our kids can answer. They're concrete. Like, I can ask my 3-year-old, why are you feeling the way you're feeling? My foot hurts. Okay, so let's talk about that. If you can do that with a 3-year-old, you can do that with anybody. So discipleship always is essentially digging into what's going on in that person's heart and soul, and their emotions, their feelings, their thoughts. What are you thinking? Like, don't say, what are you thinking? You know, as a parent, what are you thinking? You know, when a parent's mad, it's like, no, what are you actually thinking about this? And you'd be surprised. I think my 9-year-old is super insightful, and she'll say stuff, and I go, wow, I never thought of that. That's interesting, and maybe we should talk more about it. David, I think you're onto something. He had a second question, and I think it's off of that, but it's questions is actually being curious with your kids creates more curiosity in them and allows them to be able to see the world through essentially a worldview of seeing what God's doing in their worldview. So,
yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So I think what that does is it leads to another question, because as soon as you create this culture of curiosity in your kids, they start to ask some really hard questions. And it's not these simple questions of you know, how did God create the world? Well, that's not a simple question, but
how did God create the world? Out of nothing, ex nihilo.
Yeah, don't use that word with your kids. They'll be like, what? Dad, you're weird. But like, for example, so my youngest daughter, Evelyn, so she's 7, and she just started to ask these really hard questions. For example, she said, hey, Dad, you know how in the Bible it says that Satan was cast out of heaven because he sinned in heaven? I was like, yeah, I know that story, and I could even regurgitate the whole thing to her. And then she asked the question, was there sin in heaven? And I thought, whoa, how do I answer this question? Because if Satan sinned because he got arrogant and proud and tried to take the throne from God himself, where did that initial desire for a coup come from? Like, was there some kind of like a broken spirit in him? And where did that broken spirit come from? So if sin never existed before Satan actually sinned, then where did the inclination to sin come from? And I'm like, holy cow. So how do we take these
wait, how old is she?
7.
Yep.
Yeah, so how do we take these really complex questions that our kids are asking us and not necessarily dumb it down, but to explain complex theological truths to our kids in a way that they can actually understand it without them thinking, all right, Dad has no idea of how to talk to me. So how do we do that?
I'm on the entry phase of this. My oldest is 6, so we've had some conversations, but I think so I won't speak like an expert. But from what I've found, the best way for me to address some of those questions is just to say, if I don't really have an answer, is to be honest and say, I don't really know. I've not thought about that, and let's figure it out together. Or let's talk about this, or I can ask somebody who knows. I think we do more damage when we try to act like we know the answer. So I guess that's my entry level advice.
I don't think that's entry level, because I literally was going to say the same thing about I don't know. Because I think sometimes we are trying to give answers to our children, and then when they leave our home, they've only been given the answers that we have, and then when they encounter other answers, they haven't discovered it themselves. Yeah. And so, like, as long as we're in the discovery process of discovering Jesus together, I think that's where those questions can be answered well, and we can lead them closer and closer to Jesus in that way. So it's not always, you know, like people joke about a Sunday school answer. Like every answer to every question is Jesus Christ, right? It's Jesus, Jesus, God, Jesus. And I think in some ways, we need to deal with the tension of, I don't know how you answer that question, but I don't necessarily think you can definitively answer that question. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, and that's okay, and there's tension there. But there's a reason there's tension there, because it requires faith. And that's what I tell my kids. I'm like, sometimes I'm not going to be able to answer your questions for you. You know, your dad is limited, but I know a God that's infinite, and I trust him. And so I think you're essentially sharing the gospel with your kids when you're kind of admitting that maybe you don't have it all figured out. I think. And
I was proud of her. She's actually asking these kind of questions.
Well, yeah, I would be too.
Oh man, how do I respond to this? So, and that leads me to another question. So, I'm not trying to steal the host job from you all.
No, I love it.
I actually like this. This is kind of fun.
All right. So I think there's a difference between sheltering our kids and then protecting them. So, so protecting our kids is I want to make sure that they're not exposed to the trash of this world so that they can maintain purity in their life. That's why we're going to put protections on and boundaries, limitations on what they can watch on TV, sites they can visit online. We're not going to give our kids a cell phone, especially a smartphone, until we actually think they can be trustworthy with it. And then they've got all kinds of options like the Gab phone that protects from social media opportunities. I want to protect my kids from having too much internet or web or TV access. So there's no TV in the room, no computer in the room. And even that, we want to protect them from certain environments and people that could harm them and potentially corrupt them. So we want to protect them. However, I think there can be cases where you can, in a sense, overprotect and get into the realm of sheltering your kids so that when they actually grow up and get out on their own, they're not prepared to handle the corruption and the evil that they're going to be exposed to, and therefore they're not able to handle it well. So they're more likely to be burned by it than triumph over it. So I know you know I know you know what I'm talking about. So how do we protect our kids while not sheltering them at the same time?
Well, I think there's definitely a balance. What I've seen is kids that spend their whole life in a Christian home and they go away to college, and that first semester they just like lose it morally, and because they don't even know how to stand up against what the other side is. They don't know that. And I think in some ways, if parents are, to use your two words, there's protection or sheltering. If you're sheltering, you're not actually telling your kids what the other side of the story is. Like, what's the consequence of this? You just don't do it. It's a listen to mom and dad, don't do this. And over here, when you're protecting, you're saying, we're protecting you from, and you kind of give a description of what you're protecting them from. I'm not saying you're going into use the word trash, getting into the trash. It's just like, there's trash here, and that's why we have this boundary, and this is why, and you need to trust us. But you also are explaining. It's apologetics. I mean, is what it is. I went from a very sheltered homeschool environment as a kid to a state college in California.
Oh yeah.
It was like,
they're not the same.
Whoa! It was crazy, right?
State college in California.
In California, I say that, and people here are like, ooh. But the thing is, my parents prepared me to critically think, and I think the difference between sheltering and protecting goes back to critical thinking. It's like, what are you going to do in this situation? My parents would coach me on how to respond to someone that wants me to drink, or how to respond to someone that's like cussing all the time or swearing all the time. They had ways of me dealing with those. Did I always follow it? No, I was a teenager. But the reality was, I knew the other side. I knew what was on the other side, so I didn't want it.
Yeah.
I had no desire to like do things that my friends were doing because I didn't want to be a part of that. Like, because I was making a choice, though. They didn't make the choice for me. And that's the difference, is we have to get to the point where we slowly give away that choice making and we're still protecting. You know what I'm saying? Like getting the phone without the social media, that's fine. But at some point, when is that point that you're going to choose and say, you're responsible enough for this, but you know that you can always talk to us about anything that happens. Yeah. And so really providing that openness, I think, is the huge difference. I remember families that sheltered their kids so much that I don't think they ever were around people without the parents around. So it was like one of those things where it's like, do they have any friends? Do they ever do anything? They're always at home. And I think in some ways that's good. You want to protect your family, but also like having experiences is important. Missions trips, things like that, where you're able to see the bigger picture of the world and rather know what's going on around you so that you are not contributing or being a part of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's a difficult thing to, I think, find the balance between those things, because one of the things I'm afraid of, and I shouldn't be afraid of this, because I'm trusting God for my kids more than I'm trusting myself for my kids, right? But I'm afraid that they would go to, even in some cases now, a liberal arts Christian college and be exposed to experiences or ideas or perspectives that we've tried to protect them from. And they're like, well, I've never thought of it this way. And then all of a sudden, I'm no longer the primary influence in her life. It's her peers. It's the university itself. And I've heard too many horror stories of kids going away, like you said.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to do is take the limited time that we have right now to prepare our kids to think critically so they can make the wise, biblically based, Jesus-centered kind of decision. The other thought that I have is this, is whenever our kids do mess up, and your kids are 6, so they've never messed up yet, right?
Yeah, never.
All younger than 6. When our kids come home as a teenager and say, I really messed up, and I let my boyfriend or I let my girlfriend do things that they shouldn't have done, and I've made a poor decision I can never walk back. Or I did something, I got in trouble with the law. So how do we as parents, because at that point it's not a matter about sheltering or protecting them, it's about how do we receive them. And so how do we as parents show the love of Jesus to our kids while not condoning bad behavior, but at the same time giving them a safe place to recover and be restored, in a sense?
And initially, I go back to the protecting and sheltering conversation. I feel like protecting is very much conversational, and sheltering is just like you just don't.
It's authoritative.
It's authoritative, yeah. And so I think if we are raising our kids in a protective household where they feel safe to bring anything to us, or we may even expose them to things that may be a little bit different than how we view, but we explain the consequences or whatever that is. I think by the time and granted, I don't have teenagers, so we'll find out, but by the time they get to that space, they'll feel safe enough to come to us and say, I know that I can tell my dad this, and I know he'll still love me. And I know that he's going to tell me that it was wrong or whatever, but he's still going to love me, and he's going to have a conversation with me to help point me in the right direction. And I feel like that's where it starts, is in the younger years of just being that protective force, a refuge for our kids in a way where it's like, hey, you can come to me anytime and we will talk about it. I'll never look down on you. I'll never, act out against you, but like, I want to help guide you this way.
Yeah. Well, and I think even along those lines, it comes down to the story of the prodigal son. When you said that, like, how do we receive them and protect them, but not the story of the prodigal son? When the prodigal son comes back, he's repentant.
Mm-hmm.
And so the father embraces him. You know, if your child is coming to you, I know you're going to tell me what I did was wrong. And you just go, but I love you. You're receiving them in a way that they won't get received anywhere else. I mean, I look at my life. There was a period of 3 to 4 years where my relationship with my parents was tenuous, is the word I would use. And out of that, it went from, I'm not going to talk to my parents about this because I don't really want them to get involved, to I'm going to call them because they've got wisdom. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's that some of that is a maturing process, but what we're finding in our culture is kids never get back to that. I think if you talk about rebellion in teenagers, you're going to think of, there's periods where they don't want to talk to you, right? I mean, let's be honest, but there's got to be that point where they do. And so, for example, I mean, in my wife's life, it's the opposite. She would say, I always talk to my parents. I never had that point. Yeah. And so that's what our goal for our kids is, that they would be able to be received no matter what. Yeah. But you just mentioned two things. You mentioned a situation where it's like, okay, the law's involved or this or that's, like, it's a little bit heavier. And I think the only way that we enable in those situations is we continue to help when there's no repentance and there's a lack of respect between people, whether it's respect between family members or whatever. I mean, I think of situations I've known in the past where, you know, someone's been convicted of something 10 plus times. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it's like, I'm not going to bail you out. It's just that's not reasonable. You're not learning anything. And so when we get past the point of like being able to have influence, and our only influence is, say, money or shelter, then that's a problem. And so, I mean, that's a bigger discussion. There's all kinds of different, but when you were talking about that, I thought of enabling. I mean, like, we don't want to enable we don't want to enable people to sin, but we also want to love them and embrace them, especially our family, especially our kids.
So the phrase that comes to mind, I think I've used this before in a message. It's uncompromising generosity. Yeah. And so it's if there's kind of a brokenness or a mistake, it's not that we condone it. It's not that we encourage it. It's not even that we say, you know what, it's fine. It's not a big deal, because that stuff is a big deal.
Yeah.
But it's uncompromising. It's also generous in the sense that we're trying to extend the love and grace and mercy that Jesus extends to us. I know we got a whole lot of roof noise.
Yeah,
going
I know.
on
Right now it's like thunder up there, man.
Thunder. That's right. Hopefully they can't hear any of this. But something that came to my mind is my wife and I recently had to talk about what do we do when our son, who's 10 years old, is exposed to illicit sexual content, whether that's in a movie or a TV show. And there's a wide range of what that looks like. It could simply, be innuendos. It could be simple language, or it could be as far as hardcore pornographic material, which we hope he doesn't get exposed to. But the reality is, in this world, he's going to be exposed to it in some way, in some form. And when he does, and we find out about it, or what if we discover that he actually looked for it online, how do we respond to that? Because that stuff, it makes both Heather and I, and I'm confident for you guys as your wives, as well as most people watching, that kind of content not only sickens you because it's disgusting, but also it angers you because you know just how deadly of a poison that is. It is so deadly. And so when our son is exposed to that, the tendency for us might be to get angry and be like, who showed him this stuff? Yeah. Or to get sick and be like, oh man, doesn't that feel gross now? But we don't want to do that because that's just going to push him away. So we're trying to figure out, how do we ask him clarifying, investigative questions like, well, Judah, when you first saw that, what did that feel like? Was that surprising to you? Did it make you feel good or make you feel bad? And so turn the conversation so it's a safe environment for him to be discipled through, as opposed to him being shamed in. Because
that's what I was going to say. The shame, I think there's a lot of shame in those conversations. And if anything, I'm learning what each of my children feel shame differently. Like all of my kids have different, I don't know if it's called shame triggers. Like they do certain things, and if I talk a certain way, they feel shame. And so I'm trying to unpack that before I have to have those conversations. And so, like, I don't necessarily have the answers because I'm not having them. Like you're talking about future, but I think even now, some of those conversations are preemptive. I mean, the birds and the bees. Can we just bring that up? I mean, talk about the birds and the bees with your kids. If they're going to learn it in school, they've already learned it from their peers. And if they've learned it from their peers, they've learned a completely tainted, unbiblical version of what the birds and the bees is. Like it's just not good. So we as parents have to be proactive. You're being proactive. You guys are having conversations now. How do we ask questions so it's not bad?
Yeah.
So we're not in it. And the other thing is, I think a lot of times as parents, we're angry for them, but we act angry at them.
Yeah.
And so it shifts, right?
Yeah.
You're heartbroken that they've been exposed to that kind of poison. And it's not just that kind of stuff. It's all kinds of things, right? It's I know that we're talking about stuff that's a little bit out of our depth, partly because we're not trained in parent-child counseling and psychology and stuff. And also our kids are still fairly young. They've got a lot of exposure and a lot of life to live yet. But there are tons of resources on this. When you talk about the birds and the bees, we've got some booklets that made it easier to have the conversation.
Yes.
Okay. And so if somebody listening to this wants some of those resources, maybe like put in the comments, hey, and we can probably direct them towards those resources. But I think if coming off of a VBS weekend where the emphasis was the spiritual development, relational connectedness of our kids, it's how do we translate that into the practical ways that we relate to our kids? And those are not always easy translations. No. Because the topics are not always easy. So
so I was going to say this. When you say that, how do we translate it? The first step in translating it is, how did our parents talk to us? Because we tend as adults to talk to our kids the way our parents talk to us. Yeah. And if our parents, like if you're part of a family that maybe you grew up in the church and your parents never talked to you about the birds and the bees, you won't talk to your kids. Yeah. It just, like, they've done studies on this. Yeah. It just doesn't happen. So the difficult but needed conversations that need to happen, it'd be good if you're married, if you're not, just to think, okay, what conversations do I need to have with my kids? and when do I need to have them? It might depend on your kid's maturity, emotional maturity, or where they go to school or whatever. But I don't think many of us as parents sit down and do that. Wouldn't you agree? I mean,
yeah, because it's a hard thing to do. And if our vision really is to build Jesus-centered homes, we tend to think that all that means is that I take my kids to church and get them plugged into some kind of like a kids group or youth group or something like that. When in reality, even though we need to do that, sometimes it's those case-by-case hard conversations. It's the reacting in the Jesus-centered way when they mess up, when they screw up, when they make these big mistakes. And that's what over time builds that Jesus-centered home culture. So, yeah.
Well, and I don't think you can plan them though. Like you're not like, tomorrow I'm going to have the birds and bees conversation. Like when you do that, it makes it awkward.
I think, that made it easy for us.
Oh, no, seriously?
No. Yeah.
I put in the James Dobson tape. That's what people did in the 90s, right? James Dobson will explain
Don't put a tape. No,
tapes.
Get rid of that.
Anyone watching, tapes were before CDs, which were before Spotify. Okay, all right. So
look at you, Antique Roadshow here.
Okay.
No, I'd say maybe it's not easy for you. It was easier for us to plan it. And so what we did is I took Judah out to breakfast, and we just had a good time. And then we just got in my truck, and then I read the Birds and the Bees book to him. I guess it was awkward, but it was much better than say, you know what, we should probably just talk about that sometime.
We should lean into the awkward because otherwise we won't have the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also like I feel like in that instance, like you've probably taken Judah out for breakfast before, right? So I think a lot of times like in the church, we're like, okay, we're going to take him out for breakfast.
We never do that.
We're going to like ramp this up so that it's a one experience. But if you have that relational equity in a sense of like, hey, I'm going to breakfast with dad, then the conversation is already less awkward because it's not like, oh no, dad's scheduled a business meeting with me. You know what I mean? Like that can be how it can feel if we're not consistent in spending time with our kids too.
Yeah.
That could make it very awkward.
Very awkward.
Like, why are we going to ice cream for the fourth time?
I know we're
week?
just scratching the surface on this stuff, guys. I know it is. And this is probably going to elicit hopefully a lot more conversations that people have. I would say in their small group, in their community life group, is a great place to ask some of these questions. How do we disciple our kids when they screw up? How do we walk them through after they've been exposed to all the different kinds of spiritual poisons out there?
Because they will.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to mess up. It's not going to.
That's right.
I remember I got a ticket when I was 16.
How dare you?
I know. But then I lied to a cop.
That's a smart idea.
It was terrible. I use this as a sermon illustration. But I lied to the cop and said that my dad was in a diabetic coma.
Oh, my.
What I didn't know is that they would call my parents.
Oh, my.
So I had a California Highway Patrol officer call my parents. I'm 1 mile from my house. I'm literally can see the exit sign where my house is. He gave me the ticket and he said, son, that's 6 months in prison for lying to a police officer. And I was like, I'm going to prison. I got home. It was the weirdest thing. They're like, go to your room. They were standing at the door. And I was like, I'm dead, right? But what's interesting is that broached a whole other conversation. Like, why would you ever do that? You know, I've had conversations with my wife because our boys, our 3-year-old and 7-year-old, they lie and it drives us nuts. And I always tell her that story because I'm like, I was 16 and I could have been arrested, right? I literally, like, I don't know why I would have lied about that. It was a dumb thing to lie about. And I was speeding, so I was caught. I don't know. Like, but I look at that situation and I go, how would I approach that? Because it will happen. It's not a matter of when. The thing is, and Eric, you kind of alluded to this, but I think we need to prepare for it. We can't just wait and it just shows up. I think that's a huge part of it too.
And I think the best thing that we at Brookside can do is encourage the conversations and facilitate the conversations by giving resources that we have access to, and also encourage small groups, community life groups to be a place where these kind of conversations can happen. So to me, that feels like a good place to kind of wrap it up, unless you guys have more.
Yeah, let's do it.
I just think it was a great VBS weekend that led to a Summer Blast Sunday, and to, again, all the volunteers that really put so much time and energy into making it a great weekend. So
definitely.
We are back on this next Sunday with part 3 of our Nehemiah series, and so we will look forward to doing that again.
So thank you for joining us. for this week's episode of Church Unscripted. We're glad that you joined us. This conversation took a turn that I wasn't expecting, and so that's the beauty of the unscripted conversation. And so we invite you to join us this Sunday, in person or online, for part 3 of Nehemiah, or come back next Wednesday for Church Unscripted. Again, like the channel, or like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend, and we'll see you next week.